you for joining us today for another NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to promote and foster public interest in the arts and to educate people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org, or you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Another of the NAC's missions is to promote community and understanding through art. Before I introduce our speakers for this evening, the National Arts Club feels that it is important to briefly address this historic moment in our city and nation following the death of George Floyd. Art is a powerful vehicle for protest and change. It bears witness to humanity's atrocities as much as it documents its beauty. In 1997, the National Arts Club awarded Black photographer Gordon Parks the NAC Medal of Honor for its outstanding achievements in photography, including the work capturing the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s and the social injustices faced by the Black community. Sadly, many acts of deliberate and systemic violence against people of color documented by Parks still persist today. We hear the calls of protest taking place throughout our city, the country, and the world. As we continue to fulfill our mission to promote the arts, we will do so while promoting peace, equality, and full civic participation, and being a welcoming and safe place for all. Today, we're joined by Julie Satow, an award-winning journalist and author, a regular contributor to the New York Times. Her work has also appeared on National Public Radio, Bloomberg Businessweek, and New York Magazine. The Plaza, which is her first book, received a rave review in the New York Times Book Review and was featured on the book podcast with Pamela Powell. NPR named it one of its favorite books of 2019. Julie is a lifelong New Yorker. With 3 New York Times bestsellers to his credit, Model, The Ugly Business of Beautiful Women, 740 Park, The Story of the World's Richest Apartment Building, and House of Outrageous Fortune, 15 Central Park West, the world's most powerful address, Michael Gross is recognized as one of America's most provocative writers. He is the editor-in-chief of Avenue, a contributing editor of Departures, and his journalism and other writing has appeared in magazines and newspapers throughout the world, including the New York Times, New York, GQ, Esquire, and Vanity Fair. Michael lives in New York City as well. The Plaza, 740 Park, and House of Outrageous Fortunes can be purchased at a discount from our independent book sale, Books on Call NYC, and we'll be sharing a link in the chat program. Following the conversation between Julie and Michael will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, here are Julie and Michael. Please enjoy the program.
Thank you, Nadine.
Thank you, Nadine.
So Julie, I think I'm supposed to ask you questions and get you to talk about the Plaza Hotel.
Yes.
But before we talk about the Plaza Hotel, let's talk about you. I know that part of the impetus for writing this book was a personal connection to the Plaza. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I would like to thank Nadine. Thank you, Michael. And also say I really appreciate everyone who is taking time during this very challenging moment to just have an hour of respite. Hopefully we'll have an interesting conversation about New York and history. So I really do appreciate it. As for why I wrote the book, I do have a personal connection with the Plaza. My first impetus was I wanted to write a social history of New York, and I felt like the Plaza, you know, it really is this kind of perfect lens to tell a history of what happened in the city over the past 100+ years. It's situated right at the foot of Central Park, which is in the center of Manhattan, which is in the center of New York, which in many ways is certainly a center of the country. And really what happened at the Plaza over the years is really reflective of what happened in the city and America. So it was kind of this great vehicle to tell the story. I also am a lifelong New Yorker, as Nadine said, and I went to high school right by Central Park, so I spent lots of time in Central Park looking over at the Plaza, which you can see very clearly. My grandmother used to stay there when she would come and visit. So I spent a lot of times having tea at the Palm Court, which was quite a special memory. And I was quite fortunate to get married there. So all of that sort of came full circle when I was choosing a topic for a book. I also, as a reporter, covered the story of the hotel when it was converted into condominiums in around 2005. So I had also a lot of knowledge just from my reporting experience.
And just out of curiosity, are you an East Sider or a West Sider?
Back then, I was an East Sider growing up. I am now a proud West Sider in the West Village. So,
which is perfect because the Plaza is right in the middle.
It's true. It's right there.
So what's interesting is that for all of the New Yorkiness of this book, you actually started reporting it, 7,000 miles away? Do you want to tell us that story?
Yeah, I know. I just said I wanted to write a social history of New York, and the beginning of my book is in India. At the time that I was writing the book, the owner was this guy, Subrata Roy. So I felt like what was happening in New York and what's been happening really over the past decade, I think it may be changing now, but it really was the story of global wealth and money coming in from other parts of the world, and sort of how that has been changing the face of New York. So I have a slide I'll share with you. You can see, so the owner at the time when I began the book was this guy, Subrata Roy. He was this very colorful Indian tycoon. He had many famous friends. Here he is with Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister. He had countless fancy cars. He even had his own cricket stadium. And then basically like a few weeks after he completed his purchase of the Plaza, this happened to him. He basically was accused of running this massive Ponzi scheme that resulted in millions of very poor Indians losing their life savings. This is actually an image of him going to the Supreme Court in New Delhi, and a protester threw black ink at him. So he ended up, in fact, running the Plaza from his jail cell. He was imprisoned. And then at the time that I started writing the book, he had been let out of prison, but he was under house arrest. So I felt like it was kind of this great vehicle to kind of begin the book and show what's been happening at the Plaza now. So I did go to India, and I interviewed him with many, he had guards with machine guns welcoming me, and lived in this massive mansion, but he wasn't allowed to leave it. So,
and just so that we can dispense with him, was he eventually convicted or acquitted?
He was never quite convicted. He he's still, as far as I know, is still under house arrest. He's not allowed to leave India. But he basically is paying back about $3 billion plus interest to the victims. And so but he didn't serve any more time in jail. He spent about 2 years there.
And I want to come back to the owners, but does he still own the Plaza Hotel?
No. So right before the book was published, about 2 years ago now, he lost it to the Qataris, the sovereign wealth fund of the Qatari government, purchased the Plaza. It still owns the Plaza, and yeah. So
let's put a sticky on owners, and we'll come back to that.
Great.
Let's go back to you for a minute.
Okay.
So, as a book writer myself, and you and I have known each other a while, and you've actually helped me a great deal by telling me a little bit about how you researched your book, because I've now stolen some of your techniques. Thank you. But talk about the process of coming up with a topic, coming up with an angle of approach, and how you go about excavating it's 130 years of history, right?
Yeah, it was definitely a daunting task. When I began my book project, I had never written anything longer than like 1,500 words, and the book is probably about 100,000 words. So it was, the first 2/3 of the book really are research based. It's very historic. The Plaza opened in 1907, and really up until the 1970s, I had to use research because, you know, there weren't as many sources to actually interview who were around at the time. So I think what you're referring to is I found these amazing resources at the New York Public Library. I was lucky enough to get a desk at the Allen Room, which is, I know where you are too. And there are these amazing digitized resources now. If you remember, like, back when you were in high school, you used to have to comb through microfiche in order to find stories, and you really needed to know the date and the newspaper where you could find stuff. Now it's essentially like Google. All these newspapers from, you know, over 100 years ago have been digitized, and you can use keyword searches. So that was a huge resource for me. I managed to unearth all these stories that had really been forgotten to history, because if people aren't retelling them and they're not, you know, currently being published in books or histories, they get forgotten. So it was a really great way to uncover stories that people had not remembered.
Now, when you said 1907, remind me, was that the first Plaza Hotel or the second Plaza Hotel?
Very good. You read my book. There was an original Plaza Hotel. It was not there for very long. Originally, the Plaza was actually it was a skating pond way back in the day, and it was where very wealthy people would ice skate. Then that was covered over, and it became the original Plaza, which was a much smaller structure, and that lasted for about a dozen years. And then in 1907, the current building that we know was built.
Aha, and it's also been expanded over the years, right? It's not, the building that we know is not what was built in 1907.
That's true. It was expanded in the 1920s, but essentially the building has basically remained the way it was. It's actually a landmark, thankfully, so it cannot be torn down, and it was landmarked in the 1960s. So there was an extension in the 20s, but other than that, it's basically the same thing that it was when it was originally built.
And was the person who built the first Plaza the same person who built the second Plaza?
No. We can start maybe with the owners. You had mentioned the owners. Yeah. So the first owner of the Plaza that we know today is this guy, Harry Black, who is one of my favorite characters in the book. I will share with you an image of him, not Sobrado Roy. This is Harry Black when he was young, and this is him older, and he was really quite a dashing figure. Harry, he built the Flatiron Building in New York, you know, the one that looks like an iron. He built Macy's Herald Square. He was essentially the first real estate magnate in America. He was a huge landlord. He was really powerful. He lived quite glamorously in the penthouse of the Plaza. And Harry was a really big believer in stocks, especially during the 1920s, during the Jazz Age. So unfortunately, the 1929 crash was really brutal for him. He lost most of his fortune, and he met sort of a sad demise. he tried to drown himself in the bathtub of his Plaza suite, but his valet revived him, and he eventually, about a year later in 1930, he did die by a self-inflicted bullet wound to his head. So that was the first owner. There's other owners that are really exciting. This is Conrad Hilton, who bought the hotel in the 1940s. And this was really Hilton's first big New York hotel purchase. He was trying to kind of make a name for himself. He was married at the time to Zsa Zsa Gabor, the famous actress, and he was quite glamorous, but he wasn't really this huge hotel owner the way we think of him today. And the Plaza blue bloods and the fancy, guests of the Plaza sort of felt like he was this Texan, this uncouth Westerner, and they were not huge fans of his. But he bought the Plaza, and then he bought the Waldorf Astoria just a few years after that. So.
And was there someone in between? Did Black actually own it when he killed himself?
So what happened was, in the 1930s, Black's company continued to own the Plaza. And I know we've talked about, what's happening in New York and around the country right now. Certainly the Plaza has been through several difficult periods, and certainly the 1930s, the Great Depression and Prohibition were double whammies for the hotel. And so Harry Black's company continued to own it, but it sort of started to go more and more into disrepair, really until Hilton bought it.
And Hilton really re-glamorized it, didn't he?
He did, for all the hemming and hawing of all the Plaza fanatics, he instituted air conditioning in the hotel. He put television screens in there. So he did really kind of bring it up to date in a way. It had really been, lagging. So, yeah.
And there was a famous nightclub in the lobby. Which owner installed that?
Oh yeah, the Persian Room was very famous and glamorous. That was around that same period. It really hit its heydays in the 1950s, and actually, it was really famous for. I can jump around if you want. I can show you. One of its most famous acts was, was this woman. This is Kay Thompson, and she was a cabaret star. You can see her performing here with Andy Williams. She was a regular at the Persian Room, and she also then wrote the Eloise books. So there you see her.
But now, was this also during the Conrad Hilton period, to drag you back to the original question?
Yes, it was around that period in the 40s, and then, yeah.
And how long does Hilton own the hotel?
So he owns it until the 50s, and then it goes through various owners, not quite as glamorous as him. I would say, the owners were less exciting until we kind of get to the 1980s. That's
the 1980s. That's going to be interesting. But wasn't it kind of like corporately owned for a long time?
Yes, the Westin owned it. The Westin, and they actually were the only owners ever to change the name of the Plaza. It was always just the Plaza, but they changed it to the Westin Plaza, and did corporatize it quite a bit. Over the years, the hotel really went through a number of iterations, glamorous and then periods of not so glamorous. That was also the time when there was the white tulip, when they took the beautiful oak room that some people may remember, with its beautiful dark wood and kind of very stately atmosphere with windows facing Central Park, and they painted it all white and carpeted everything, and had cocktail waitresses wearing skimpy outfits. So
that would have been the corporate Plaza, right?
That would have been the corporate, exactly.
And just because it's a personal memory for me, when I first came to New York after college, there was also a Trader Vic's in the basement, wasn't there?
Absolutely.
Where everyone went to eat poo-poo platter and fruity drinks. Was that also post-Hilton?
Yes, that was in like the I think it opened in the 60s, in the late 60s. Yeah, absolutely. It was kind of the place where college kids would go and be served alcohol underage. These huge, blue drinks with umbrellas in them. Lots of fun stories in the book about Trader Vic's. Yes, so that was in the basement. I mean, there was even at one point way back, sort of at the beginning of the plaza, there was even a restaurant called The Grill, which served meat, and you could kind of pick which steak you wanted in a refrigerator. But they also, in the summer rather, they would pour water on the floor and create an ice skating rink, and an orchestra would play. So,
Wow.
yes.
Okay. So we go through the boring corporate ownership, and then along comes who exactly?
I mean, I will show you who comes. Let's see, where is that? This guy.
Oh.
Yes. Here is Donald Trump. He bought the hotel really at the height of kind of the go-go 80s, when he was kind of buying up a bunch of stuff. You can see him in his office at Trump Tower here, and right behind him is the Plaza. He had a direct view of the hotel, and he was always sort of, dreaming about owning the hotel. He called it the Mona Lisa and a masterpiece. So he bought it, and interestingly, he installed his wife, Ivana, who's also here, as the president. And she's even up to today is the only female president that the Plaza's ever had. And she worked incredibly hard. She did a really fantastic job. She was very strict and very detail oriented, but the Plaza did very well under her ownership. You can still see, if you go to the Plaza today, gold faucets, gold filigree that she oversaw. She actually had painters come and paint with actual gold over much of the finishings at the hotel. But even though the hotel did really well under her, when Donald bought it, he borrowed a ton of money to purchase it, and he added more and more debt to do the Taj Mahal and several other projects during that period.
You mean the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So he was expanding to casinos, all this. And so essentially, no matter how much money the Plaza was making, it couldn't really cover all the debt service on the hotels. So eventually, Trump became the only owner in the history of the Plaza to bankrupt it.
Well, and Ivana wasn't his only wife.
No.
So wasn't there a little incident that happened during his ownership?
Yes, there were many instances of events that happened. Trump, at the time that he owned the Plaza, he was dating Marla Maples while his wife was running the Plaza. He put her up in an apartment he owned just around the corner from the Plaza and right around the corner from his house in Trump Tower. And so the divorce played out at the Plaza. Much of the staff was forced to listen to a lot of arguments and drama between them, and eventually, they did get a divorce. So yeah.
But what happened to the Plaza during that? Did it remain in Donald's hands?
So he continued to own it, but he became more and more in sort of a more and more difficult financial situation, and the banks were really closing in on him. So it was part of this larger corporate bankruptcy that he arranged with the banks. The banks decided not to force him into personal bankruptcy, but rather these corporate bankruptcies on the Plaza, et cetera. And eventually it was the creditors, the bankers, sold it to a Saudi prince, a prince from Saudi Arabia, and a billionaire from Singapore. And it was really the start of foreign ownership of the Plaza, which is a trend that we still have today.
So Donald Trump was responsible for letting foreigners into the Plaza?
That is true. There were many, I mean, he really fought hard. He had a fixer, Abe Wallach, who you may have heard of, who was quite an interesting character. And he was sort of Donald's lieutenant at the time. And Abe worked very hard to try to save the Plaza from bankruptcy and from Donald losing it. So he even, there was a hidden room in the Vanderbilt suite of the hotel, and he went into this hidden room. He was there for several weeks taking notes. That happened to be the suite where the purchasers, the Saudi prince and the Singaporean billionaire, were negotiating their deal. So he listened in from this secret room in the suite, took notes, and did all kinds of scheming to try to kill the deal. For instance, he had the fire department come in and close down the building at one point to stop the negotiations. He tried to borrow money from the same bank that they were borrowing from to confuse the bank and try to kill the deal. So
the only thing he didn't do was try to build a wall.
It's true.
So the Saudi prince and the Singaporeans end up owning it, and then what happens?
Yeah, so it goes through various iterations, and eventually what happens is in 2005, an Israeli developer, Mickey Naftali, part of the Elad group, buys a hotel. He had tried to buy a different building to turn into condos, one which you know well since you wrote the book about it. He lost out on this big deal that he'd wanted to make, and instead he managed to buy the Plaza, and he was a condominium developer. And through the ages, the Plaza really has reflected, as I mentioned, a lot of the trends that you saw in New York City as a whole. And certainly during this period, it was really the height of the condominium craze, similar to what we've seen recently. But this was kind of the first real surge in condominiums. They were just being built everywhere. And he wanted to turn the hotel into a condo. Clearly, it is a building that has a lot of emotional connection for a lot of New Yorkers, and there was a lot of pushback. The hotel union is quite strong, and they fought the deal, and it became this big story, which is actually what I covered as a local reporter, which first was my introduction to the Plaza. And eventually they struck a deal where the majority of the most beautiful rooms facing Central Park were converted into condominiums for the uber wealthy, and they kept kind of a boutique hotel there, which is still the scenario we have today. They also landmarked certain interior rooms that was part of the deal, so that you couldn't destroy them, such as the Oak Room and the Palm Court.
And in fact, they restored some of those rooms, didn't they?
They did. I mean, it was interesting. The developers got an incredible amount of criticism for the way they built the condominiums, but they did put a lot of money into restoring the historic rooms. For instance, the Palm Court was always famous for its ceiling. It used to look out into the air. It used to actually let sunlight in, and it was Conrad Hilton actually removed that ceiling to put in the air conditioning in the building, and Elad restored that. They spent about $1 million just on the ceiling to create this glass, although it's now light bulbs that give it that glow. So they did, but they also did a number of things that really made it hard to run those spaces as restaurants. So for instance, today, all those rooms are basically not in use because of the way that it was divided up and the ownership is created in the hotel. So you have the Palm Court, but the Edwardian Room, the Oak Room are just vacant rooms. They're not even being used.
Well, let's not even go there because that's such a sad story for New Yorkers. But there's another instance of interesting nepotism here, because Mickey Naftali actually wasn't the owner. He worked for an Israeli billionaire, didn't he, named Suave?
Yes.
And Suave installs his daughter just like Donald installed his wife. Tell us that story and what Gal Nauer did.
That's true. So Isaac Chuva owned. He's a billionaire, an Israeli billionaire. He wasn't as active in the day-to-day. Mickey was more the guy running things, but Isaac's daughter was an interior decorator. She was in her early 30s. She had never done a project of this size, but she was given the job of creating all the interiors, save for these historic rooms that we were just talking about. So that was part of why when a lot of these very wealthy people bought the condominiums and saw what they had actually purchased, since they bought them sight unseen when it was still under construction, they were quite aghast. Her taste was questionable. Instead of real mahogany wood, for instance, they used, composite wood from China, cheaper materials, things like that. So
for liquidators, basically.
Exactly.
And you cover that very famous lawsuit from the Russian who bought just under the eaves of the plaza, don't you?
Yes, the Russian in the attic was quite a famous tale. So when it was converted into condominiums, Andrei Vavilov, who was a famous Russian oligarch, purchased one of the penthouses for over $50 million. He was very excited to have this glamorous home. And when his wife finally walked in, because as I said, you bought these apartments, as is often the case now, you buy them when they're under construction and you look at renderings and images of what you will be purchasing. When she actually walked in to see what she had bought, she burst into tears and was quite upset because the building is a landmark and it is not new construction. So the windows are what they are. They tend to be small. There were pillars in the middle of the living room, things that could not be moved since it's a 100+ year building. And she sued, they sued. It was a huge lawsuit, and it really created a ton of bad press. I do have an image of Andre and some of the other people who did end up purchasing. Sorry, I'll go through here.
Ivana just wants the screen, Julie, that's all.
What? So here are some of the owners. Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, he spent his wedding night with his wife there and always cared about the plaza, and he bought 2 units at the hotel. Here at the bottom is Andrei Vavilov, who ended up at the Time Warner Center, not far away after he sued to get out of his contract. And this is Harry Mcleod, who is a famous real estate developer in New York, who purchased the largest and most expensive 1-bedroom. It's about a $60 million 1-bedroom for his art collection. It essentially has, I think, something like 50 windows in it, and it just is for his art. He recently went through quite a famous divorce with his wife, who's pictured there as now ex-wife, and she got the apartment in the divorce, so.
Well, this is quite a rogues gallery, but I think that there was a period when the plaza was a little bit more glamorous. So maybe let's talk about over the years. Who are your favorite guests and habituates of the plaza?
Yes, I would love to do that. Okay, let me show you. Let's see. So obviously there's many amazing guests that came to the plaza. The first one was Alfred Gwyn Vanderbilt. He's quite a famous guest. He was the first guest ever to check into the plaza, 9 a.m. In the morning. He walked in. He was the first guest. He was the first one to sign the hotel registry. And like a lot of the early guests at the hotel, he actually lived there. He was not a transient, as we think of hotels now, that they are transient guests. Actually, back then, the idea of hotels and apartments was quite interchangeable, and he lived at the hotel. His mother lived right next door at the Vanderbilt mansion, which is where the Bergdorf Goodman department store now stands. So they were neighbors. And actually, that is his first wife that he's with. Her name was Elsie French. And about 6 months after he moved into the Plaza, he divorced poor Elsie French after he met a woman horseback riding in the bridle path in Central Park. So it was quite a scandal. That first day, I also love this photo. These are the first ever New York City taxi cabs, which are parked in front of the Plaza. And because it was such a big deal when the Plaza opened, as a marketing ploy, they had these taxi cabs there and they allowed all the Plaza guests to ride them for free. Obviously, they soon became New Yorkers' favorite mode of transportation, and they replaced the hansom cabs, which are the horse-drawn cabs that everyone used to take. So I think it's always ironic that today the only place you can find horse-drawn hansom cabs in New York is actually right across from the Plaza, which is a funny little aside. The Beatles. The Beatles came to stay. This was an amazing chapter, and I include this funny photo here. You can see all the teeny boppers racing to this is in front of the Plaza. When they arrived, they were trying to attack the car with the Beatles as they arrived. And the other image is of obviously 3 of the Beatles. It was taken, these are children that their father actually was the manager of the Plaza at the time, and he really wanted his kids to come down and take pictures with these famous rock stars. So the youngest one, that's little Greg there, he was watching cartoons and he didn't want to come, and his father dragged him downstairs and made him get some clothes on. And I guess right before the photo was taken, Paul McCartney told the photographer to wait because poor little Greg's fly was unzipped since he had gotten dressed so quickly. So you can see his hand is sort of hovering over his crotch area, which is a funny little story I have. I mentioned Kay Thompson. She lived at the hotel and eventually wrote the Eloise books, which were, huge marketing thing for the Plaza, and really created a whole new era of Plaza fans and created a lot of revenue for them. And she lived for free off and on at the hotel for years until like the 1970s when she was quite older and wasn't writing any more books. And the Plaza was having a lot of financial difficulties because the city was facing all these issues. It was near bankruptcy in the 70s. And so they evicted her, and they only gave her 24 hours to leave her rooms at the Plaza. So
nasty.
Quite dramatic. Here we have the black and white ball. Here's Truman Capote, who had just written In Cold Blood, and he hosted this glamorous ball. And this is him with his date. This is Katharine Graham, who was the newly installed publisher of the Washington Post at the time, and many famous guests. You can see Mia Farrow here, and her boyfriend at the time, Frank Sinatra, or maybe it was her husband. Fabulous masks. It was really kind of the heyday of the Plaza and glamour.
We've got those people.
Exactly. And I will say, I mentioned that the 1930s were really tough going. One of my favorite guests are the so-called 39 widows of the Plaza. I just have a few photos here. So in the 1930s, there was prohibition. The hotel couldn't sell alcohol, which was a huge revenue generator. There was also the Great Depression, obviously. And what kept the hotel afloat were these women who were kind of these eccentric characters. This one in the top corner here holding the dog, that's Princess Suave Palagi. She moved in 1909, and she brought with her a menagerie of pets. They included supposedly an ibis and an owl, and eventually while she was at the Plaza, she went to the Ringling Brothers Circus and she bought a lion that she saw there, a pet lion, which she kept in the bathtub of her Plaza suite for a few months until the Plaza said, "I'm sorry, but you have to get rid of the lion," and she gave it to the Ringling Brothers Circus, to the Bronx Zoo. And this bottom one is Clarabelle Walsh, who is also a great eccentric character. She lived there for about 50 years at the Plaza, and she is credited with inventing the cocktail party.
Wow.
I know, in 1917. The last of the widows, unfortunately, I don't have an image of them, but it was this woman, Fanny Lowenstein, who was also a great character, who was there up until the 80s, and she tussled with Donald Trump. So it's a lot of fun stories.
So aside from Donald Trump and the cranky oligarch in the attic, what are some of the low points of the Plaza? I mean, I'm thinking right now, 11 years after the Plaza opened, there was a Spanish flu epidemic in New York, rather like the one that we've just been living through. What are some of the low points? Was that one?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that also coincided with the World War, and it was very difficult. Princess Palagi, who I just mentioned, she actually, her wealth dried up and she had to leave the Plaza during that period, and she ended up actually dying a pauper. But there were many, there was a lot of challenges. I didn't actually find any cases of Spanish flu at the Plaza, unfortunately, but that would have been a great tie-in if I could have. The Depression, the Great Depression was hugely difficult. They closed many rooms. The Oak Room was closed. They took the bar out. They actually made it a brokerage firm for E.F. Hutton. They tried to think of ways to rent it. A lot of the hotel was just sort of shuttered, much like today. The 1960s and 1970s were incredibly difficult periods, the late 60s and 70s for the city and for the Plaza. I have an image I will share here. This image with the candlelight is actually during the big blackout in the 70s. You have guests who are dining by candlelight in the Palm Court because, of course, the Plaza had no lights. In the middle, this is actually feminists who were picketing the Oak Room in 1968. It included Betty Friedan. The Oak Room was actually one of only 2 restaurants in the city that did not allow women in, so they decided to make take a stand. And right after this image was taken, they went into the Oak Room and tried to get served. Supposedly, the waiters just came and took their table away and left the group of women sitting in the middle of the room with no table. So it didn't go over well, but eventually the Oak Room was open to women. And then this last image of the garbage is basically all the sanitation strikes in the 70s when the city was really in fiscal difficulty. The Plaza had to, the whole facade was just covered in trash. So it has definitely gone through its fair share of difficulty.
So today we have COVID-19, we have looters in the streets. What's going on at the Plaza right now?
Yeah, it is closed. Like a lot of hotels, they closed in late March. It is boarded up like so many other, businesses in Midtown right now. It's covered with, plywood, and it's not open to guests. There are still people living in the condominiums, obviously, because those are people's homes and apartments, although a lot of them are not there. But that is still open, but you really can't go in right now. And, all the workers are wondering what's going to happen next. So it's definitely a difficult moment.
And are the condos actually occupied? I remember when the building first opened, standing in Central Park and looking at the Central Park face of the Plaza and thinking, well, maybe they sold all these apartments, but nobody lives there.
Absolutely. And that is really the story of what's been happening in New York for a lot of these high-end buildings. Most of the people who bought condominiums there, it's one of many homes they own. So, they may spend a weekend there once or twice a year, but that's about it. They're not, for most people at the Plaza and those condos, they're not their full-time residences. More than half of the people who bought the apartments actually paid cash and used shell companies. I found, for instance, like the former prime minister of Vanuatu, which is a tiny little island nation near Fiji, bought a $15 million condo at the Plaza. I mean, I don't think he ever went there. These are just investment properties, a lot of them. So
have any of these people been, the condo owners in particular, been pulled out of there in handcuffs for flight capital or tax violation or looting their national treasuries?
I don't think there's been any scenes of mass arrests at the Plaza condos, but certainly there have been businessmen that have faced criminal charges. There's an owner who owned, I think, 3 apartments there, a Spanish businessman who has been in prison, and actually the apartments were claimed by his creditors. So yes, there have been cases like that.
Wow. So what does all of this portend for other great historical buildings? Right now, the Waldorf Astoria, which has been closed for years and was owned by a Chinese insurance company, and now it's been taken over by the Chinese government. And they're advertising like crazy, but it's still all boarded up. Properties like these that really need to live, what's your guess? Are they going to be able to?
I think it's really challenging. It does not make financial sense for the city, these large hotels, or rather for the owners. These large hotels like the Plaza, what the Plaza once was, what the Waldorf once was, which, as you mentioned, is now basically the same thing as the Plaza. It's mostly going to be condominiums with a small boutique hotel. You just can't make it work financially to have multiple restaurants and have this large hotel. So I don't really know. A lot of the rooms are landmarked at the Plaza, so they cannot be changed, they cannot be destroyed, which is wonderful, but they're basically laying fallow because the owners and the hotel union haven't been able to work out a deal, and they're just not being used. And obviously with the pandemic, with COVID, it's so challenging for hotels in general right now. I had been hopeful that maybe the Qataris, who are incredibly wealthy, might, this building is a trophy for them. It's really symbolic, that they might put the money in to really revamp it and improve it. And, that has not happened yet. So I hate to end on a down note, but I'm not overly optimistic.
So do I. Hate to end on a down note. So let's go back to you for a second. And then I think we should ask questions. But what's next for you? When I wrote 740 Park, all anybody wanted to know was, are you going to write 825th next? And the last thing I wanted to do was write the same book again. Are you going to write a book about the Waldorf?
No, I don't think so. Not right now. I agree. I have, in a few weeks, I have an exciting, I'm doing a podcast about the history of Tampax, which is a bit of a departure, but it's sort of a historic look at the tampon industry. So I'm doing that. And I have an idea for my next book. It is not about a hotel, but I'm still kind of in the research phase, so I'm not totally ready. What about you?
Well, Nadine actually said at the very beginning that I was the editor of Avenue magazine, which I was for 2 years while I was hiding at the beginning of the Trump administration, thinking that nobody would want to read a book about anything other than Donald Trump. Kudos to you for publishing one, at least in part. So I hid for 2 years, but about a year and a half ago, I quit. And I've been working on another social history book that also I'm not terribly eager to talk about, but it's about a number of great American families and how they've survived over the course of American history. So instead of looking at a building, I'm looking at families.
Sounds amazing. I can't wait.
Me neither. I just want to be done. So how do we do this with questions? Do we look at these? Should we start at the beginning? Let's see. Has the Plaza been threatened with demolition before it hit the National History Registry?
Yeah, interestingly, Conrad Hilton tried to convince the owners who he sold it to tear it down and build a office tower there, much like the Savoy Hotel, which was catty corner from the Plaza, was torn down and made into the GM building, a famous skyscraper. So he was trying to get the owners to do that very thing, and they resisted. I think, a lot of the owners that have owned the Plaza over the years really have loved it. It is a trophy. It's an emblem of something. So thankfully, the owner said no. And then shortly after that, it was landmarked.
Which Susan Halper asked, who was the architect. And since his work still stands, I think he would be very happy. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yes, I think I have an image of him. He was Henry Janeway Hardenberg, and he actually built the Dakota apartment buildings as well. He built the original Waldorf Astoria, which is not the Waldorf we know now, but is actually where the Empire State Building now stands. And he really saw the Plaza as kind of his masterpiece. The Waldorf was much more ornate, and he created a much more simplistic facade for the Plaza. It really is supposed to be sort of a Roman column, essentially, with the base is made out of rusticated marble, and then you have terracotta brick, and then the mansard roof, the green mansard roof, he meant to reflect the green of Central Park across the street. So it really is his masterpiece.
Wow. Now, someone named Jerry French wants to know, are there other books besides yours that you especially like that are set at the Plaza? I think Eloise, obviously, but are there grown-up books and other children's books?
Well, this is not exactly the same thing, but my friend Fiona Davis wrote an amazing book about the Chelsea Hotel, which I actually love. It's a nonfiction, it's a fiction book rather, about the Chelsea, which is really fun. In terms of the Plaza, I mean, it's most known for movies, plays like the Plaza Suite, which was supposed to be on Broadway right now, but obviously isn't. There isn't that many books that really, happen at the Plaza per se, surprisingly.
That's amazing. Not even a mystery novel?
I mean, there must be, and I'm sure I'm missing it. So please correct me if I didn't mention it.
There's a question from Jerry Atnick wondering if you know of any plans to reopen the Oak Room. And I still remember the days of the Edwardian Room, and both of those are huge losses for New York. Do you think they'll ever reopen those restaurants?
So the issue is the Union. I mean, it depends on who you ask, but the Union it is a Union hotel, and the Union is powerful. So for instance, at one point they wanted to open a sushi restaurant in the Oak Room, and you had to hire Union waiters. And, most Union guys are not Japanese sushi chefs. So it was really difficult to make it work. Also, it's really expensive because the Union does protect its workers and has a lot of rules and very high salary. So it's very hard to kind of pencil it out and pay rent and have a business there. There were several different attempts at first back in 2007 and 8, but none of them made it. And so since then, it's just basically been a standoff. There is the basement food hall, and if you go now, I mean, the two rooms that you can eat at are the Palm Court and the basement food hall, which are basically kiosks, and these companies rent them and pay the hotel for them.
Well, the food court is actually wonderful. I went there all the time. Yeah. We've been chastised for calling it the Spanish flu. Let's not call it the Spanish flu. No national distinctions here. Let's see. Do you feel that the ownership has changed things for the Plaza for the better at this point?
No. I wish I could say yes. I think the Qataris have not really, look, they're very wealthy. They could easily make a deal where the Union gets what it wants, and they're not earning a ton of money in these spaces, but they're doing it for the good of the hotel and the good of New York, and that has not happened. So no, but certainly there were amazing owners through the years who did wonderful things for the hotel. So,
well, and many restaurateurs say that unions are a great block to running a profitable restaurant. When we're at this moment of foundational change, do you think that the unions might give a little and make it easier to open these rooms once we can all go out of our houses again?
You know, the Plaza, like so many things, it really was emblematic of what was going on in the city at the time. When the Plaza was made into condos, all these buildings were being made into condos. Tons of hotels were being converted. And the union really decided to make a stand with the Plaza and say, no more, we're losing all these jobs. It's not fair to us. You know, we don't want to lose the Plaza. It was the biggest union employer in the city. So it really is kind of this important place for a lot of the union guys. And I don't see that changing.
Gee, well, it almost feels like everybody loses as a result, doesn't it? No comment. Someone asked if there's ever been a documentary made about the Plaza.
I know that Architectural Digest did a video. I know because I got to partake in it. I don't think there's been like a full feature documentary about the hotel. I think it's a great idea. I'd be happy to help anyone who wants to do it, but not yet.
So, and now I have a question, which is that when the Israelis redid the Plaza, they moved the lobby from from Central Park South to the Bethesda Fountain. It's called Bethesda Fountain, I think, to the fountain entrance. And now the entrance on Central Park South, which used to be kind of the main entrance to the Plaza, you can't even walk in there, can you?
So if you've seen like, you know, the famous Alfred Hitchcock, North by Northwest, there's a famous scene of Cary Grant walking into the Plaza, and that's the Central Park entrance, Central Park South entrance, and that was always the main entrance of the hotel. And correct, now it's been glassed off, so you can peer in and see it, and you can see the wealthy condo owners coming in, but you are not allowed to enter that way. You have to enter on the Fifth Avenue entrance, which was actually only built later in the 1920s by Harry Black. It was not the original entrance to the hotel.
Well, and that photo you showed earlier of all the taxis outside, that was on that was facing Fifth Avenue, right? So when you 3 months ago, or hopefully next month, walk into the Plaza from that entrance, do you still feel the magic?
I do. You know, it was an amazing experience to delve into the history of a building like this. And I feel such an affinity and love for it and what it represents. So yes, it's definitely not maybe how I remembered it as a kid, but it still has its magic.
So my least favorite question when I'm being interviewed about one of the books that I've written is, what surprised you the most in your reporting? I'm going to change that question for you. What memory inside that building from your reporting is the one that you're going to savor for the rest of your life? What one thing happened inside the building while you were reporting the book?
Well, so this was not an authorized biography of the Plaza. So the ownership was not cooperative while I worked on the book. So I did spend time there, but typically, you know, quietly, not publicly. But when the book was coming out, I got to be on the Today Show, which was totally awesome. And I got to go into a bunch of rooms that I hadn't been allowed into. I had sneaked in some of them by myself because often they were just empty and no one was around, like the ballroom. But I got to go into the Oak Room and the Edwardian Room, which are locked and not open to the public. And that was really, it was just really special to be able to be in there. I mean, they're empty, but the beauty is just really a wonderful thing to see.
Don't we wish that they would open those rooms again? Yeah. So I think we've kind of done it. How are we doing on time, Julie?
Exactly 7.
My goodness. Well, I can't thank you enough for letting me do this with you. It's great fun. And we should all thank the National Arts Club for letting us leave our homes virtually and go to the Plaza for an hour. I'll leave the last word to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity and for taking an hour to explore the Plaza. I would say that both Michael and my books are available. If you haven't read them and you like a taste of what you've heard, you know, please delve in more. And I'm always available for comments or questions, things you didn't get to ask on social media. So please reach out. I love hearing from readers. So.
And do you have a website?
I do. It's just my name, juliesatow.com.
And mine is mgross.com. If anybody wants to ask me a question about one of my secretive apartment buildings, I'd be happy to answer it. And so here's to you. Congratulations on your paperback.
Thank you.
And
Thank
a
you
great
so much.
year for you. I hope you have another one.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.